for the ruling class to sell. I mean, Michael Foot, people may remember, left-wing leader of the Labour Party, he moved the resolution, he moved the vote in the House of Commons to send troops to the Falklands to kick out the Argentinians because the poor British farmers were trapped, sheep farmers were trapped behind Argentinian lines. It was a kind of, superficially, a more plausible war to sell. And I mean, the level of flag waving, none of us were used to it. I mean, the intensity of the flag waving, we see it now, but in a way, I think we're smart enough to be able to deal with the flag waving. That came as a real shock. And so that was just an additional kind of sense in which we had our backs against the wall. So running the paper in that period was very hard. Chris steered it through the 1980s very effectively. Something else happened, just to kind of slightly switch the focus, or it's connected to this. The old Communist Party, the Communist Party of Great Britain, began its deep decline. As it declined, it had a magazine called Marxism Today. It was very peculiar. The Communist Party went down. It was an effective force, by the way, especially in Birmingham. People will know. The Communist Party is an incredibly important organisation in the Birmingham factories, especially the engineering industry here, for several generations. And it began to go belly up in the 1980s. In a sense, it was double-edged. Good in a way, from our point of view, but actually it went down as the movement went down, so it wasn't so great. But the Communist Party had a magazine called Marxism Today. That became more and more glossy, more and more trendy. One of the things they did was to kind of protect what was effectively a sharp lurch to the right. Almost they were over-fascinated with Thatcherism. Almost, I won't say they became Thatcherites, but they were in a state of shock and awe with Margaret Thatcher, Marxism Today, and they used Gramsci, they used the famous Italian revolutionary Marxist Gramsci as a kind of cover to protect their shift to the right. Now Gramsci was a serious revolutionary. He was in the same league as Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg. But this lot used Gramsci as a kind of cover. I don't want to get into I haven't got time, the detail of how Gramsci's concept of hegemony was used to kind of both explain and almost defend Thatcherism. Chris took them on. Chris, in the paper and in our other publications, took them on over Gramsci, reclaimed Gramsci. If you go back and look at this, Chris reclaimed Gramsci for the left. There's a big struggle, a very important struggle. I can only just touch the surface. For me, I would name that as an additionally important contribution amongst very many that he made at that time. Now I'm going to shift into what I regard as the two most important written contributions that he made in his life, in my view. Other people can disagree, but this is, to a degree, it's a personal judgment by me. The first one is the People's History, and the second one is his latest book. Of course, there's a long history in writing about economics. But let's just talk about the People's History for a moment. It's a completely brilliant book. Chris obviously took a lot of time off. He stopped being editor of Socialist Work. It took at least a year, if not longer, to go and write it. And I mean, I constantly dip into that book, partly because of my own research interests, but there are a whole number of really important, not just insights, but innovations. I just want to touch on 4 innovations in that book. The first one is the one that Alex Klinikos picks up in the obituary in this week's Socialist Worker, and that is to do with very early societies and the insight that Engels had in particular, that women and men in very, very simple early societies were more or less equal, and that something happened with the development of agricultural societies when human groups stopped being hunter-gatherers and became settled agriculturalists. Something happened in terms of the way the surplus was collected and created to build in to societies the gender divisions which seem so hard institutionalised. Now Engels had that insight based on quite crude anthropological studies. One of the things that Chris does, in a sense quite simple, but a lot of very hard work, he read through the up-to-date anthropological studies 150 years later and developed Engels' argument to prove conclusively that Engels was right about this. And that's fantastically important for obvious reasons. Especially at that time, there was a tremendous argument about, at 2 levels, a tremendous argument both to defend the concept of women's liberation, but also to argue with a very strong and strident section of the women's movement that kind of gender oppression was built into our biologies, that men were inevitably going to oppress women because that's how men are. So the application of Marxist argument, and again as a living science, in a serious, sustained and detailed way to challenge that view was very important, and the organisation went through a lot of arguments, terrific arguments, both internally and externally at this time about that. Chris built